Welcome to Deep Dive number 2, Jen Yip. Jen is the founder of Lunch Money, a personal budgeting app. And I wanted to talk about Jen's article that she wrote about a year ago called The Biggest Mistakes I've Made with Lunch Money So Far. And the reason I think this article is really interesting is that she's writing about her product in a way that doesn't feel salesy or pushy, but it also makes people interested in the product. And at the same time, the post itself is interesting even if you have no interest in the product. So let's begin. So the post talks about how 6 months into running this app, Lunch Money, she had made a lot of mistakes. And so she's walking through all the mistakes she's made and what she learned from them. So one of them is not really preparing sufficiently for her launch. So one of the mistakes she made was that she had these settings for her development environment that she actually accidentally pushed to the live server that customers were seeing. So that caused problems. She also forgot to check whether she was on a paid plan with her email provider. So she very quickly ran out of her trial limit. One that I thought was really funny was that she was embarrassed about not having a mobile app. So her advertising copy really emphasized the fact that she doesn't have a mobile app instead of focusing on what she does have, which is a great web app. She talks about trying different pricing. So $3 ended up being too low and $8 a month ended up being too high. Another one I really like was she talked about how she experimented with the free trial. So one of her competitors had a 38-day free trial. And so she was like, oh, I'll do one better. I'll have another week free and have a 45-day free trial. And then as the trial started to end, she would send people a 2-week free extension. So she was being very generous with users, but it meant that users had 2 months to use the product before Jen made any money. And so she realized that was a mistake, and she changed it to just a 2-week free trial. And then she also realized that she changed the trial period and the price at the same time, so it made it hard to learn the lessons there of like which one affected sign-up rate and payment rate. So she realized that she can't change two variables at the same time if she wants to learn. And then the last one, which I thought was probably the best one, is being too afraid to share my story. And she talks about how she didn't have an about page and she was kind of hiding the fact that she was this solo developer wearing all the hats in the company and doing support and development and design. And then she finally started talking about it, and users were actually really impressed, and they loved the fact that it was just Jen doing all this stuff. That she was producing a product that users liked more than these bigger competitors, and she was doing this all on her own. So this really effective article in a lot of ways. And so the thing I mentioned that I really liked about it is that it's not salesy. So you could think of this kind of as content marketing. It leads people to Lunch Money. She's talking about this budgeting app that she runs, but she never talks about the app itself. She's never saying like, oh, and you should use Lunch Money because it has this feature and this feature, or like it's better than my competitors because of this, and this reason. She never talks about it at all. Any features she mentions are just kind of incidental. And reading this post, it makes you interested in Lunch Money because you're reading about somebody who cares a lot about quality. And so if you are at all interested in a personal budgeting app, then you're like, I don't even really care what features it has. I want to check it out because I love that this author cares so much about what mistakes they're making and how they can learn from them. So I think that does a great job. This is like a really underused skill that people don't exercise very often, of writing not like about how great your product is, but writing things that your audience would be interested in, and then doing it in such a way that leads them to your product and shows that you're somebody who's knowledgeable about it and can serve them. And the tips themselves, they're in a way specific to Jen's experience. Like you probably very few readers who read this article were users of Plaid. And so it feels like, okay, like I would just not do this with Plaid, but I'm not using Plaid. But this experience of having certain settings in your development environment that you don't want to ever push out to customers and wanting to have protections in place for that, that's very generalizable. And then I definitely related a lot to this mistake of assuming user intent. So like I definitely have launched things like this where I'm hyper aware of things that are wrong with whatever my app or service is. And I feel this defensiveness, like I don't want anybody to point out that my offering is missing these things. So I'll overcorrect and make a big deal about how like, no, I know I don't have a mobile app. And I think Jen is doing this thing as well. And like she's telling the story in this relatable way where like her main ad copy is about what she doesn't have, and that's silly. And so she learned that like the much better strategy is to make the copy focus on what you do well, that you have a great desktop experience. So I like that a lot. And then I definitely related to this experience of people being more interested in your product when you share your personal story. The other thing I think is useful about it is that it has this very distinctive visual style. So a lot of choices she made are very unusual, like the way that it's a bold underline under links, a blue like blue link. You don't see that very often. Headings are in red. These little visual callouts are in red. The captions for images are in yellow. So I think these are all nice visual choices, but more importantly, they're very distinctive. So if you read this article and you liked it, and then you come back and you read another article from Jen, you have this positive association in your mind of like, oh yeah, like this is the woman that shared all these like cool mistakes that she made. I like this author. And so I think that was a really effective choice. And it kind of matches the style of Lunch Money. So it leads you a little bit toward the product that she works on as well. And this reminded me of a quote that I read from Cortland Allen, the founder of Indie Hackers, which is one of the largest communities for bootstrap founders. And the way that he built up Indie Hackers was by posting things to Hacker News and attracting the audience there. And he said that the visual style of Hacker News was or the visual style of Indie Hackers, rather, was an important part of that because everybody else was writing on Medium and it looked the same. It was just white with black text. And so if you look at Indie Hackers, it's this dark blue color, and it is very visually distinctive. And so he says if you ever read two Indie Hackers stories, you would instantly remember that you'd been to this website before. And I think that's a really useful tip. That's a useful thing to put something in your website that makes people remember and have this positive association if you wrote a good article. And I think that's something that Jen does in her article. And it speaks with a personal voice. Like the entire article is, she could have written it in this way that's sort of detached, like, and that might have been the impulse if you don't want to like associate yourself with all these mistakes you made. It's easier to say like, mistakes were made, environment variables were pushed that shouldn't have been pushed. But this is all from her perspective, and these are all these mini stories from Jen's perspective. Like she's saying, I started to get notifications, and she's sharing her experience as she goes through all these things. She realized it was my own dumb fault. I accidentally left. So you could tell these stories without the emotions and without the personal touch, and I think it would make these lessons a lot less engaging. And so having it from her personal perspective, I think makes the post so much more effective. And just, I love this joke in the title too, of like the biggest mistakes I've made with Lunch Money so far, which is implying Jen is going to make lots more mistakes. So these are just the ones she's made in the first 6 months. And it's true, like we all continue to make mistakes. So it's true to say like, these are the mistakes so far, but I love that little acknowledgement of that. And then another thing she does that's pretty subtle is mentioning the Hacker News launch. So she talks about how she launched Lunch Money on Hacker News 6 months before. And to people who are coming from Hacker News and reading this article, I think it involves them in the story a lot more. It's like, you were involved in this. You were part of why I was able to launch this app, and these are the mistakes I've made in the past 6 months. Like this is your 6 months check-in on my progress since then. And so I think that makes the audience on Hacker News a lot more invested because they feel like they're part of the story. So I think that's a really effective thing you can do if you do have a history with Hacker News that is relevant to your product. And I've mentioned before in the course about the importance of making the post friendly to people who want to do a first pass, just skimming through. And I think this post definitely does that well. Like you can get a ton out of this article just by reading the headings and looking at the images. So just like looking at the images and the captions, it tells a lot about what the story is, and it gives the reader a lot of information about whether they want to invest the time in reading and figure out if it's worth their time. So if we pop over to the Hacker News discussion, we can see that the response was really positive. It got 454 points. People really like the story. People are really interested in the process and all the things that she learned from it. And I think it makes people interested in the product as well. And I reached out to Jen about this article, and fortunately she was kind enough to share some insights about the process of writing it and what the results were. My first question was what the goals of the posts were. So she said that demystification is a top goal in her writing. And I think a lot of tech bloggers have this tendency to go the opposite way and try to make their work seem larger than life, like everything they touch is perfect and effortless. And Jen doesn't like glorification posts, and she talked about how she wanted to show that you can still make these mistakes and they're not going to make or break you. And so that's what happened with Lunch Money, and she wanted to share that story. And I was curious if she was nervous about admitting mistakes, especially on Hacker News, where people there is some arrogance on Hacker News, and so I think a lot of people are nervous about admitting mistakes, that people are going to jump down your throat and be like, "Oh, I wouldn't have made that mistake." But Jen said, yeah, she was a little bit worried about that people would read it and say like, "Oh, well, I don't want to trust my financial information to somebody who makes mistakes." But she said it was actually the opposite, that people really liked the honesty and vulnerability, and it makes you more human. And I think that's definitely true. Like, if you think about a big competitor like Mint, they're this like big faceless company. So, if they make a mistake, who knows what happens? Whereas with Jen, the buck stops with Jen, and she's cares a lot about these mistakes, and she's talking about how she's learning from all of them. And Jen says, I think that's one of the reasons why folks are opting for indie developed products. And I think that's true. Like I've noticed with customers of my products that they really like having this human touch and knowing that they're talking directly to the founder who cares a lot about the company. And I was curious what she thought about in terms of keeping the post engaging. And she said that one of the things she thought about was the anecdotes, and she was very deliberate about which stories to include. So she wanted to include ones that were actually interesting to the audience, and she went back and looked at her drafts and realized that the ones that she cut out were things that required too much context. So she kept it to these things that taught a lesson in a very concise way, and I think she was very effective at doing that. And I, of course, was curious about the results. And she said that the month that this post went to the front page of Hacker News, it's to this day the highest growth month she's ever had. But in the spirit of demystifying and not making it seem like magic, she mentioned that also another confounding factor was that, not confounding, but supporting factor, was that this tech blogger, Alexander NL, he's a Dutch tech blogger with 500,000 followers, also tweeted about Lunch Money, and that led to a big surge of signups in March 2020. But yeah, so this post definitely was effective at getting readers interested in her app. And so if you're interested in more from Jen, her app is called lunchmoney.app, and it's a multi-currency budgeting app. Her blog is lunchbag.ca, where she writes about the process of building Lunch Money. And you can find her on Twitter. She's at Lunchbag.